Are we ready? Are you ready?
I am, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Dennis Normile. I'm a member of the committee that arranges these PAC events, and I'll be the moderator this afternoon. Shareholder activism does not have the history in Japan that it has in other countries, especially when it comes to encouraging corporations to behave more responsibly when it comes to the environment and to social issues. We have today Julian Vincent, who is the Executive Director of Market Forces, an Australian environmental NGO which has had apparently some good success in getting Australian banks and insurance companies to agree to stop funding coal projects by 2030 among the banks, and to get the insurance companies have agreed to cease underwriting new coal projects. And in recognition of this activism, our guest was awarded a Goldman Environmental Prize earlier this year. He is here in Japan because his organization, Market Forces, is working with a number of Japanese NGOs in putting proposals before shareholder meetings of 4 major Japanese companies. I think the shareholder meetings are this week and next week?
Last week and this week.
Last week and this week. Mitsubishi Corp, Tokyo Electric Power, Chubu Electric Power, and Sumitomo Mitsui Financial Group. And so he's going to give us an update on exactly what they're hoping to get the corporations to do and what success they're having. And with that, I'll turn that over to our guest, Julian Vincent.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Hello, everyone. Konnichiwa. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to meet and address you all today. I'd like to thank the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan for the invitation to be here, and Taka-san for suggesting me as a speaker. There's a lot I'd like to discuss with you today, and hopefully over the next 20 minutes or so, you can look forward to many of the elements that make up a good story. The challenging of status quo, some political intrigue, at least a little espionage, and the imprisonment of some of our heroes, and a sudden twist in the plot, and a lot of overcoming the odds, all against the backdrop of our central plot, the existential threat facing humanity. Let me start by introducing myself. So I'm the founder and executive director of, as Dennis has introduced, an organization called Market Forces. The idea for that name was essentially an attempt to recast the term. Market forces is often something we hear about as a kind of mystical or hand of God sort of phenomena, which can be quite disempowering to the average person. By adopting the name, I wanted to point out that market forces are simply the sum product of everybody's choices and actions, making it a much more active term than a passive one. For nearly 10 years, my organization has been advocating to shift finance and investment away from activities that damage the environment and into those that protect and enhance it. And of course, the climate crisis is central to our work. Some of the results of campaigns we've taken part in include Australia's biggest banks committing to have no thermal coal exposure by 2030, our 3 biggest insurers committing to be out of thermal coal by 2030 or sooner, banks across Asia ending finance to new coal mines and power stations, and institutional investors like pension funds divesting of coal, oil and gas companies. Key to what we do is engaging with people in their capacity as customers of banks, as buyers of goods and services, as members of pension funds, and as shareholders of companies, to demand change from companies that are either engaged in activities incompatible with a safe climate future or otherwise financing those activities. And this brings me to what I'm doing in Japan. One of the major drivers of change from companies and financial institutions in recent years has been shareholder action, essentially working with shareholders to make interventions at companies to hold them accountable for the climate risks they create or are exposed to. Shareholder action can take many forms, but most well known is the filing of proposals to be voted on at companies' shareholder meetings. Once a proposal is filed, it forces conversations between the board and management of a company and its ownership base, with the result of those conversations ideally being the company taking steps to remedy the issues raised in the proposals. For instance, a proposal on human rights may result in a company setting a policy or taking other measures to eliminate modern-day slave labor from its supply chain. Usually, unless a company responds comprehensively to the concerns raised in a proposal, it goes to a vote at a shareholder meeting. This is a very different system to electoral voting in a democracy. Companies have an enormous amount of control over the conversation they can have with investors, as well as the direction of votes. Most items of business at a shareholder meeting will sail through with 95% or more support, and generally when votes against management are in the order of 10, 15 or 20%, this is seen as a significant backlash against the board. In the United States, where shareholder proposals are more common, votes are frequently approaching or even passing 50% on the issue of climate change. Last year, 48% of Chevron shareholders voted in favour of the company to produce an audited report on how a significant reduction in fossil fuel demand, such as what the International Energy Agency's net zero by 2050 scenario depicts, would affect its financial position and underlying assumptions. And last month, 52% of ExxonMobil shareholders approved a proposal for the company to produce the same kind of audited report, assessing financial statements against a net zero by 2050 scenario. In Japan, shareholder proposals related to climate change are also on the rise. In 2020, we saw the first proposal filed by Kiko Network on Mizuho. It called on the company to disclose a plan outlining how its business strategy would align with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and this received a vote of 34%. Last year, proposals were filed at MUFG and Sumitomo Corp, which Market Forces was a party to. The votes were not as high, but more significantly, there were some major changes committed to by the companies in the context of these proposals. In the case of Sumitomo, it included a commitment to no longer build new coal power stations, which the company followed through with earlier this year by withdrawing from the Matabari 2 coal power plant, which was proposed to be built in Bangladesh. I'm happy to report that as of last Wednesday, this project has been officially cancelled and the ODA investment that Japan was to provide has been withdrawn. This is a great result for all of the grassroots groups and organisations working in Bangladesh and Japan, as well as international organisations that have campaigned on this project for many years. As a result of their hard work, we will avoid the construction of an unnecessary and highly polluting new coal power plant that would have resulted in thousands of premature deaths from local air pollution impacts and release hundreds of millions of tonnes of greenhouse gases that the climate simply cannot afford. This year, we're working with colleagues at Kiko Network, 350.org Japan, Friends of the Earth Japan, and Rainforest Action Network to file shareholder proposals across 4 companies: Mitsubishi Corp, TEPCO, Chubu Electric Power, and SMBC Group. The proposals centre on 2 main themes: the need to set short and medium targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Agreement's goals, and aligning the company's business strategies with their own commitments to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. In fact, the proposals at Chubu and TEPCO are modelled on the ones I mentioned earlier at Chevron and Exxon that received about 50% support. There's also a shareholder proposal filed by institutional investors at J-Power along similar lines, calling for the setting of targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris climate goals. So let me explain why these companies are in particular a focal point. There is a world of difference, and you can take that literally, if you like, between the activities of these companies and humanity's ability to contain global warming to less than 1.5 degrees. The International Energy Agency has made clear that getting to net zero by 2050, which, by the way, is a target that still only offers a 50% chance of containing global warming to 1.5 degrees, requires no new coal power stations, No new thermal coal mines or metallurgical coal mines or new oil and gas supply. It also warns that many of the LNG facilities under construction or at the planning stage are not needed. This isn't new from the IEA, but it's simply the first time we've seen it in one of the organization's scenarios. Its executive director, Fatih Birol, said in 2018, we have no room to build anything that emits CO2 emissions. And this was in relation to holding global warming less than 2 degrees, not the 1.5 degree limit we're talking about. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres used even stronger language a couple of months ago as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report was released. Some government and business leaders are saying one thing and doing another. Put simply, they are lying, he said. He went on to say, investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. SMBC continues to bankroll companies pursuing new thermal coal projects to the tune of billions of US dollars per year. Across the entire fossil fuel sector, SMBC has loaned 109 billion US dollars since the Paris Agreement was signed and is party to transactions for massive new fossil fuel infrastructure projects. They include the Scarborough Pluto LNG project in Australia, which analysts have described as a bet against the Paris Agreement, and the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, or ECOP, where the bank is one of the project's financial advisors. This is a project littered with environmental and social issues that Mizuho's pulled out from working on, yet SMBC remains a key party to the deal. Mitsubishi's corporate reporting demonstrates how disinterested the company is in a safe climate future. Its own disclosures highlight the company's business strategy for LNG is based on a scenario where not only do we fail to meet the 1.5 degree limit, we don't even keep global warming to less than 2 degrees or even 2.7 degrees. This is a company making decisions to invest in new LNG infrastructure on the basis that the world won't even come close to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. TEPCO and Chubu are both exposed to climate change risks directly, but also through their joint venture, JERA, which is Japan's biggest thermal coal power generator by a long way, and also involved in the construction of 3 new coal power stations here in Japan. But all 4 of these companies have something else in common. They are at the forefront of a push to expand LNG throughout Asia that is one of the biggest new threats facing the climate. Market Forces recently worked with partners in Bangladesh, which I should have put the report out. To produce this report, which looks at the massive LNG expansion plans in that country. It finds about 20,000 megawatts of new fossil gas projects were planned for just one region known as Chattogram. 52% of the foreign companies backing these LNG to power projects were from Japan. It's a similar story in Vietnam, which has enough new LNG to power projects proposed to triple the country's power capacity. Again, Japanese companies lead those proposing to build either new LNG power projects or liquefaction, transport, and regasification infrastructure. My organization assessed the life cycle emissions from just 10 proposed LNG to power projects operating lifetime, involving the companies that we filed shareholder proposals with, and it came out at 1.2 billion tons. 1.2 billion tons of additional CO2 to be released. And that's bad enough, but it's a massive underestimate. Proponents of fossil gas like to compare its emissions at the point the fuel is burned to that of coal to claim it's better for the climate, ignoring the intensive supply chain required to get that gas to the power station. It involves extracting the gas either on or offshore, sending it through a pipeline, cooling it down to a minus 160 degrees centigrade, shipping, regasification, and then transporting it to the power station. And depending on the source of the gas and the supply chain, this process can make LNG as bad for the climate as coal. Now, of course, beyond the climate and other environmental concerns related to LNG, we've been given yet another reason recently to avoid entrenching ourselves in this industry any further. We're now more than 100 days into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. More than 25% of the population has been displaced. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. And Ukraine's economy has been estimated by the World Bank to shrink 45% this year. Meanwhile, the economic impacts of price hikes on oil and gas are impacting countries around the world. Now, of course, in the short term, the supply and demand dynamics of the international gas market need to be brought into equilibrium, both to prevent Russia capitalizing on increases in prices and to restore economic stability to the rest of the world. But gas companies are cynically trying to exploit this situation, using the crisis in Ukraine as an argument to build even more gas infrastructure. Now, the idea that making investment decisions in the year 2022 to build infrastructure that may come online in 2027 as a solution to this crisis here and now is preposterous and will only entrench countries in relying on imported fossil fuels that could throw their economies into turmoil the next time there's a crisis impacting supply. The Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air estimates that during the first 100 days of Russia's invasion, Japanese firms imported 250 billion yen worth of fossil fuels from Russia. Out of all countries, Japan was the largest importer of Russian coal and the third largest importer of Russian LNG. The country's share of Russia's total exports was over 10% for both coal and LNG. Now, Ukrainian activists have written to Japanese companies, urging them to end fossil fuel imports and divest from Russian fossil fuel companies, as well as new projects such as Julien. The invasion of Ukraine simply adds to the list of reasons why we need to transition from coal, oil, and gas to renewable energy as fast as possible. Now, I want to turn my attention briefly back to these massive LNG expansion plans. I spoke before about how Vietnam has enough LNG to power projects proposed to triple the country's power capacity. This is despite it already being a leader in renewable energy deployment. In the case of Bangladesh, we're talking about a country that is making capacity payments, which is essentially compensation to power plant owners for power capacity that is unused and idle to the tune of hundreds of millions of US dollars per year. Bangladesh is also facing an increasing fossil fuel import bill, and combined, these issues are pushing up power prices. Meanwhile, only 42% of Bangladesh's power system capacity is presently used. These contexts do not sound conducive to building massive amounts of new LNG to power projects. So what's going on here? Before manufacturing of power capacity takes place, a different kind of manufacturing happens. It's the manufacturing of opportunity. It's the manufacturing of markets. And it happens not in factories, but in boardrooms, in diplomatic missions and diplomatic visits and trade missions, through lobbying and through advertising and other forms of marketing. A report released just last week by Influence Map examined the lobbying efforts of 6 Japanese companies, JERA, Mitsubishi Corp, Marubeni, Mitsui & Co., Sumitomo Corp, and Tokyo Gas to push for more fossil gas infrastructure in Vietnam. These companies just happen to have business lines in producing the sort of equipment you need to build thermal power stations. Some of them just happen to deal in gas as well. They are all highly politically influential, and as the Influence Map report shows, they've been using that influence to manufacture opportunity for themselves. The report points to these companies using the Vietnamese business chamber to call for a fast tracking and approval of new LNG infrastructure plans, projects in the next power development plan, directly engaging with senior government officials in Vietnam and across Asia, and of course influencing Japan's own industrial development strategy. Last week, a briefing session was held in Bangladesh for civil society actors on the country's latest power system master plan. Who hosts that session? Who's doing the coordinating? JICA. The Japanese government effectively prepares the power system master plan for Bangladesh, so should we be in any way surprised that it is loaded with the kinds of projects that Japan's most powerful companies just happen to be good at building? Should we be in any way surprised that Vietnam, a country with near 100% electrification already, and one of the leading installers of wind and solar, has enough new LNG power capacity proposed to triple its installed power when it's lobbied so intensively by Japanese companies that just happen to have a major line of business in power plant equipment? I should acknowledge that this is not a uniquely Japanese phenomenon. The Influence Map report found the same tactics being used by Korean companies, and I'm sure that given the frequency we see American companies GE and AES among the proponents of LNG projects in the region, it's a similar story with diplomatic channels in the US. In fact, the same is true of countries home to companies that want to sell coal, oil, and gas into places like Vietnam and Bangladesh. Coming from Australia, a country that would rank as the 5th highest greenhouse polluter in the world if we were accountable for all the emissions of the fossil fuels we export, I can see the routine lobbying, marketing and manufacturing of opportunity created by some of our largest coal and gas companies to keep markets open and to try and open up new ones. And then the same companies throw up their hands and say, what can we do? It's what the countries want. They're asking for these projects. The same companies that have invested their effort to push projects into power development plans of foreign countries tell us it's what the countries want. Well, let's get real. It's what these companies want, to extract as much of their business as they can out of their business lines that create an array of environmental and social impacts and lock other countries into expensive and volatile fossil fuel imports. And this brings me to my final talking point, because the role of civil society is paramount here. In the final years recently where companies could get away with proposing coal power, the last refuges of this industry were places where the space for civil society was constrained and severely limited. And I fear it will be the same situation for gas, which is why we need to move so fast on this issue. The question of what sort of energy future countries want should be answered by its citizenry, not companies with vested interests seeking to load up power development plans with their next business opportunities. A strong civil society is vital to getting the voice of the people into the public domain where it belongs. Last month, as Dennis mentioned, I was given the honour of a Goldman Environmental Prize, the highest honour there is for grassroots environmental campaigning. One of the reasons I was so honoured to receive this award because of the company it put me among. In 2021, the prize was received by Kimiko Hirata, then of Kiko Network and now of Climate Integrate. Kimiko-san is someone I've had the pleasure of working with for many years, and you will do well to find another person as sharp, incisive and determined as she is. In 2020, the prize was won by Lucie Pinson, who's the Executive Director of Reclaim Finance in France. And I've also had the pleasure of working with Lucie over the years. The fact that this prize has been received by campaigners working on the issue of climate change through a financial lens 3 years in a row, I think says a lot about the effectiveness and the approach of this strategy. For too long, we've failed to tackle climate change through corporate and financial avenues as we have done with governments. Now, we still need advocacy directed towards political representatives, and likely a lot more of it. In fact, I hope this talk helps illustrate that tight connection between finance, industry, and government. But I want to finish by talking about another Goldman Environmental Prize winner, someone who I'd be delighted to share this stage with, but sadly that's not possible. In 2018, the prize was received by Kang Nguyen, one of the most effective advocates you could ever hope to meet. Kang was the first Vietnamese recipient of the prize, and I met her in the context of a raft of coal power plants being proposed in Vietnam. We worked together to call on banks and other investors to switch their attention to renewable energy in Vietnam, turning their backs on coal. Vietnam is an amazing place. The people are incredible, and let's not even get started on the food and the scenery because we'd be fawning over it all day. But for a civil society advocate, it's tough. I remember my first trip to Hanoi. While being driven to a meeting, I saw 2 policemen dragging away an old woman holding a cardboard sign. I had no idea what the sign said, but I was told that apparently this was a rare designated protest area. But to be honest, it looked more like a lure than a safe haven. In this difficult environment, Kang reached out to local community organisations, other NGOs, business representatives and politicians of all levels. Somehow, and don't ask me how, she brought these people together. She was able to she was able to allow the government to make positive decisions to limit coal power and its myriad pollution issues, and make those decisions on its own terms. She achieved outcomes that would avoid thousands of premature deaths from respiratory illnesses and prevent billions of tons of CO2 entering the atmosphere. She helped crack open the door for renewable energy in Vietnam to make it now among the world's most active areas for renewables development. Many of us were pleasantly surprised when Vietnam committed at the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow to no longer pursue coal power and phase it out by the 2040s. But while these changes were being made on the international stage, the lives of civil society leaders were being turned upside down. Kang was arrested in January on tax evasion charges. Now, I don't profess to be familiar with Vietnam's tax code, but the fact that she was the 4th environmental advocate from the 3rd different organisation to be arrested on tax charges in a matter of months, and these charges were being pursued as a criminal and not civil matter, does reek of an ulterior motive. Earlier this month, Kang was sentenced to 24 months jail. It's a terrible blow for her and her young family, but also for Vietnam's energy transition. Many of the coal power plants we worked on with Kang in recent years have been proposed by Japanese companies. One of the last was Van Phong 1, a project that was delayed for months after a 99-year-old resident had her home bulldozed without notice and without compensation. Despite being sponsored by Sumitomo Corp, Van Phong 1 will emit 5 times as much particulate matter, 5 times the sulfur dioxide, and 9 times the nitrous oxide as a new coal power plant that would be built in Japan today. We need a free civil society to hold accountable the proponents of these projects for their environmental, social, and economic risks. Vietnam currently stands to receive support as a result of G7 efforts to finance the energy transition, and it's vital that any financing package arranged for Vietnam comes with at least this clear condition: civil society leaders and environmental defenders are able to live their lives and conduct their work freely. It was bad enough for Kang and her fellow advocates when they were out of jail, followed and surveilled daily by local authorities. I'm sure now they would happily return to that situation, if only to be free to see their families and colleagues again. I can't imagine what it must be like to work so hard under such challenging conditions, build bridges between different sectors of society, achieve outcomes that are great for the health and well-being of your countryfolk, and find yourself thrown in jail at the end of it. The US, EU, and UK have all published statements expressing their concern for Kang and the status of Vietnamese civil society, and we need other G7 and G20 countries to do the same. If Penny Wong, Australia's Foreign Minister, is listening, welcome some comment. There is much to discuss at the G7 meeting happening right now. Japan has, by finally withdrawing financing it to its last 2 coal power stations, taken this awkward discussion off the agenda. But the urgent need to curtail oil and gas expansions and ensure the freedom of civil society participants as a non-negotiable when arranging clean energy finance packages must be near the top of the agenda. These issues cut across human rights, environmental protection, economic risk, conflict, and of course, our ability to keep enjoying life on this tiny speck of dust we call Earth. Now, I've surely given a plethora of places to jump in, so where shall we start?
Any questions from the floor? I'd like to ask about the economics of building LNG plants. Are these governments, is Bangladesh and Vietnam agreeing to buy power, agreeing to buy LNG? Because there has to be some, the companies that are going to build this infrastructure must be anticipating a payoff.
They are, in fact. I mean, one of the things that with coal has made it so easy for companies to build coal power stations up till basically now has been the government committing to buy the power off a power purchase agreement. So that's what makes the entire project so bankable. The government essentially says, yes, we will pay this rate, this tariff, for a period of maybe 20, 25 years. And that essentially de-risks the project for the companies involved. So whether it's a sponsor or the banks, they know that it's going to be at least work out for them. It may not work out so well for the ratepayers at the end of the day, but it does mean that the companies coming in can essentially do so without fear of the project going sour for them.
But with the increasing cost competitiveness of renewables, aren't ratepayers going to be paying more than they should for electricity?
With renewables increasingly cost competitive, I mean, the more renewables that are deployed, the more of a depressionary impact it will have on the prices. That's something, I mean, we see in every market. Certainly in Australia, power prices are going up where there's a dominance of fossil fuels and coming down where there's a dominance of renewables.
I'm sorry, I'm still a little fuzzy on how this works economically. The utilities, can they buy power from the most economical producer? And if renewables are putting pressure on prices of fossil fuels, can the utilities simply buy more renewable power and say no to the fossil fuel power?
Well, the utilities need to buy from what's made available to them. I think that's the key. So if we had an open marketplace, if we just allowed economics to rule the day, we'd be seeing renewable energy built left, right, and centre. And we'd be seeing those benefits become available, both environmental and the deflationary impacts on price. And you would have you'd have industry essentially able to purchase power from an open market, which is having more and more lower cost renewables pushed into it, driving the prices down. But as I've described in the talk, I mean, essentially we end up with a situation that is not based on sound rational economics. We've got overlaid onto those sound rational economics are agendas, and agendas that keep open particular units of business for a lot of big trading houses.
So the power markets are not open markets?
Absolutely not. They're engineered, and I don't mean just in a factory.
Right. Questions from the floor? Yes, back here. Would you come and use the microphone and give us your name and affiliation?
Hi, I'm Francesco Bassetti. I'm freelance and I deal in climate issues, research, policy. I'm just curious to know a bit more about the ins and outs of getting civil society into the boardroom. I know I'm familiar when you talk about government, of protests, things like this, but I'm just curious about that aspect of what you were talking about. If you could give a few more details.
So how we go about doing that?
Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Francesco.
Thank you.
I mean, each organisation is different. Some will be very international in their scope. Some will be very locally focused. I think I'll just answer from the perspective of my organisation because it's the one I know the best. We realised that there was just a gap that was taking place where there wasn't enough attention paid to the role of corporates, but in particular finance. And the approach that we took was one that was quite neutral to the idea of whether we want to engage with having meetings and just having discussions to negotiate inside a company's offices or campaign from the outside and build pressure. And I think both of those was needed. I think the more pressure that's been built on the outside, the more relevance and the more of a necessity there is to actually have conversations with us from within. So the more work that we've done and to build up pressure on the companies, and I think the fact that so much of that pressure has come from working with the company's other stakeholders. So if we're campaigning on a bank, we're going straight to the bank's shareholders, we're going to the bank's customers, we're going to people that really matter and saying, look, if you don't adopt this change, I'll take my business elsewhere or I'll vote for this shareholder proposal. It makes it very difficult for the bank to then not even try and talk to the people that are organising that activity. So it's always a weird kind of maze to navigate. Whenever you're approaching, every company is different. You'd be surprised at how some companies can be very open and welcoming right from the start. Some companies, in fact, the best ones that I've found have been the companies where they see that there's a need to address the issues that we're raising, and they take someone and put them in a position of power and influence, not usually too far away from a board level, and actually give them a mandate to advance policy. And often what we end up doing there is less public campaigning and much more direct conversation. Usually what happens, and in the case in Australia where we've campaigned for many years on the banks, it's taken a lot of research going into the public domain, shining a spotlight on what the bank's financing activities actually are, building that support among the different stakeholder groups. And there's I guess a direct equation where the amount of influence we can have inside the company in internal negotiations is a function of the amount of pressure and expectation built from the outside. That's probably a good way to describe our work. So there's not much point being over here having conversations about policy change if we haven't done this part, because then they might just say to us, well, yeah, nice ideas about the policy, come back when you've got some power. And so it's very much a matter of building power. And as I say, each organization will go about doing that a different way. Some of that is just through research, some of that is through organizing and protest. And as far as we're concerned, we're just very pragmatic. We'll try and build power in the best way that we think will suit a particular situation. Yeah, so there's no particular guidebook to it, but one of the things that, if I can continue, just with regards to the Goldman Prize, one of the things that I've been really trying to emphasize in light of that is that power exists everywhere. If you took out your wallet right now and opened it up, you'll see the logos of companies, and those companies care about your business, and it's because of that fact that we've been able to build so much power over the years and work with people on very specific targeted activities like these shareholder proposals, or very broad activities such as having people divest en masse from one financial institution to another that isn't funding fossil fuels, that kind of thing. Yeah, but the short answer is building power. And bottom up, very much so, yeah.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Hi, Mara Bhajan, freelance. It's a real pleasure, Julian, to meet you. I actually had the honor of interviewing Kimiko Hirata last year when she won the prize, so maybe I'll be able to have the honor to do that again with you. In any case, you're here in Japan and you seem to have quite clear objectives in terms of what you're trying to achieve here. So what are the worst and best case scenarios in terms of the outcome of your trip here in Japan? And what realistically do you expect to achieve in this year's shareholder meetings?
Mara, correct? Yeah, thank you, Mara. We're expecting quite a bit of support for the proposals, that's for sure. The Mitsubishi AGM was on Friday. We probably won't know the results, at least we won't know them today, maybe tomorrow or the next day. But we've had quite a bit of feedback, not just in our conversations with Mitsubishi, but also investors and some of the companies that advise investors on their voting and proxy voting. What we're asking for is just so normal and reasonable. It's if you might have heard of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. This is I think a G20 initiative that's it's well known in the world of investment now as most basic economic concepts, and key to it is having companies make measures such as disclosing short, medium, and long-term greenhouse gas emissions targets, and that's what the foci are of the shareholder proposals. There's a huge conversation brewing about accounting standards and the need for auditing and accounting to cover the potential risk that comes from failing to assess your company's resilience to a decarbonised economy scenario. So what we're asking for is completely in line with the expectations of investors. Obviously, the worst case scenario is that we fail to get change, because ultimately these shareholder proposals, yes, they're about getting a strong vote, but not as much as they are about getting changes from the companies. In fact, Sumitomo Corp last year, I think that was the lowest vote we'd seen out of the 3 climate-related proposals, but we got significant changes out of that company. So ultimately, the best case scenario is the companies do what we ask. But I think realistically, we're going to see some very strong pushback in terms of votes against management in the next few days. And hopefully that sets us up for some productive conversations over the next year or so.
So you said Mitsubishi had its meeting on Friday?
That's right. We don't have the results out yet. They don't have to disclose them straight away. So hopefully we'll see them in about a day or so.
What do you anticipate?
Well, we know that it hasn't passed the 2/3 majority needed to be adopted. It's a challenge in Japan because the proposals need to be filed as special resolutions to change the articles of incorporation, which is a little bit of a barrier. We'd rather not have to do it that way, but it is the only legal mechanism. So passing a resolution is a very tall order. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw votes in that band that I described in my talk of, say, 15, 20 odd percent. In the context of Mitsubishi hasn't had a vote against management higher than 9% in the last few years. So when you get this is not actual democracy in a democratic country. This is we're talking about a situation where if someone doesn't vote, the votes generally get returned to the discretion of the chairman or the board, and so a lot of votes get channeled in favour of how management would direct them anyway. And of course, we can engage one-on-one with investors, but these companies have teams. They're on the phone every day to their investors. It's not an evenly matched battle. So in the context of that, to see votes, if we see votes in the order of about 20% against management, that's going to be a huge pushback and a very strong signal. And what we often see is votes of that order, of that scale, often result in the company then making significant changes in the next year. Because if it's a 15% vote one year, often it's 25% the next year, and so on and so forth. And so it's only a one-way street.
Right. And so the mechanics of this, you have to buy shares, you or your partners.
Either buy shares, or in Japan that's the case. In other countries, the mechanisms are different. Sometimes you have to find, in Australia, you have to find 100 shareholders at a minimum. Mm-hmm. Luckily, we have a much longer history in Australia, and we have a much larger supporter base, so we can find those shareholders. But sometimes you have to buy the shares yourself. Ideally, we would work more with some of the institutional investors. So I mentioned J-Power has a proposal filed with it, and that's filed by 3 institutional investors, which we need to see more of that, because ultimately, when we're filing these shareholder proposals, we're doing investors' work for them. We'd much rather be getting on with doing other things because it's quite labour intensive. So,
right. Yeah. Right. Those institutional investors, are they Japanese institutions or
yes,
international?
They are. Unsurprisingly, there's a higher prevalence of Japanese institutional investors here in Japan. I don't say that facetiously at all. Like, there is a very international spread of investors, to the extent to which I think even if you look at the top 40 shareholders of Mitsubishi, only about a quarter of them are Japanese. So you have a pretty predictable spread of major institutional investors in major companies in Japan, in the US, in Europe. So beyond the big institutional investors, I mean, to name some, obviously GPIF, Government Pension Fund, would be the most significant here. Then you got Nomura, Asset Management One, a few others, names escape me at present. But then you'll have BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, and that sort of ilk. And these typically dominate the top 20 shareholders.
Right. Is cross-shareholding among group companies still an issue? Or other Mitsubishi group companies hold shares in Mitsubishi Corp?
Well, it limits our ability to get support for the proposals, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I can't imagine Mitsubishi Motors or Mitsubishi Heavy supporting a Mitsubishi Corp proposal. Although, that would be a story, right? Yeah.
For sure. We have, I'm not sure how many people we have watching online. We do have one question, which I'm not sure if it's something you can address or not, but this is from Ilgin Yorulmaz, who's with BBC World Turkish. And she asks about the impact of climate change and carbon emissions on the future of the world's second most traded commodity, which is coffee. She says that considering that half of coffee production in the world is predicted to be lost to climate change in the next 50 years, what can consumers and shareholders in big coffee bean importers in the world, such as in the US, Australia, and Japan, can they force large-scale coffee traders and coffee chain companies like Starbucks to take positions, to take action?
Can I just get the name again so I can address the questioner?
Ilgin Yurulmaz.
Ilgin. Well, thank you for the question, Ilgin. I'm not an expert on the coffee market, but I would like to use your question as an opportunity to broaden this out in a way that I hope will be still useful in terms of an answer. An argument that we don't make as often as we should to major institutional banks and institutional investors, and you could put SMBC in that category as well, is the physical impacts of climate change. So we're talking about industries, and coffee is just one part of food and agriculture and traded commodities that suffers enormous risk because of climate change that we don't often take into account. Housing. In Australia, 1 in 25 homes is expected to be uninsurable by the end of this decade. 1 in 25. What does that mean for the property market? What does that mean for mortgages? What happens when insurance payouts increasingly having to be made on physical impacts from, say, typhoons here? How quickly does infrastructure, how quickly does buildings become uninsurable here? That should be an issue for SMBC because it's invested in everything. It's invested across the entire economy. Now, we're already seeing climate risk turn up on the balance sheets of insurance companies. They always fail to provision for natural catastrophes, natural hazard claims. They always have to increase the amount that they provision for reinsurance for those claims, and they still get it wrong. They still have to increase it year in, year out. This isn't a future problem. This is a now and even a last year or last 5 years problem. This is already beginning to happen. The erosion of value, which may be the concern only to some, but obviously it's a reflection of the erosion of livelihood and life, is showing up already on the balance sheets of insurance companies, and we'll see this before very long on the balance sheets of banks as well. And it's a case that we make also to the companies I mentioned before, those big institutional investors. Well, BlackRock's invested in everything too. State Street's invested in everything. Nomura, they're invested across the entire economy. And if the entire economy is challenged through the physical impacts of climate change, well, they can look at it from both an environmental point of view and a concern, as well as a financial and economic one. So I hope you don't mind me taking that as a launching pad, that question for a broader point, but coffee is just one example of a myriad of industries that are substantially challenged. And the investors that we're talking to should be concerned about that just as much, because that will show up as a financial hit on their balance sheets as well.
A question? Well, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, what comes next? Do you go back and prepare to do this again next year, or I presume you don't just twiddle your thumbs for the next year until you come around to shareholder meeting season again? No,
indeed. I mean, I think the conversation starts very early. In fact, we met with Mitsubishi this morning to reflect on the AGM and where we are at the moment and where to from here. We made it very clear that the campaign continues until we get the changes we need. What that looks like might not be predictable at this point. I wouldn't make any claims about shareholder proposals next year. They often are a decision that has to be made many months out, but not quite yet. It's more building power. It's more working with Japanese civil society. It's doing what we can with regards to contexts like Vietnam that I described before, where that civil society space is still massively constrained, but there's a huge risk there that the country's power capacity could be tripled using just LNG to power projects. Fortunately, we've got enough ways to tap into and intervene because of the proponents of those projects, so be them Japanese companies, US companies, Korean companies. So we need to do a lot more to build power and influence and calls to action in places like this. You know, when people want something, they can get it. You know, it is hard. It does take a lot of work. You are often up against very entrenched interests, very vested interests. But building power is something that we're in a position that we can do. In places like here, in places like Australia, in places like Korea in the US, where we need so much pressure to be exerted on companies. You know, if enough people want something, governments will change their behaviour, their policy. Companies will change their behaviour and their policy. It's how we've gotten to this point where we're building the last coal power stations that will be built at this stage. I wish I was saying this years ago, but we have got to that point. And now it's a question, are we going to pivot from coal to renewable energy and give developing countries the same benefits of clean, cheap, renewable energy as everywhere else has the right to deploy? Or are we going to lock them into another generation of polluting power that pollutes them locally and wrecks our chances of keeping global warming under control? Just enough of us have to want it enough. That's how everything that we've achieved has been achieved, by making enough people want the change and to help them feel that sense of empowerment, to help the customer of a bank realize, oh, okay, if I use my voice and use my influence in this way, then I can actually be taken seriously. I can be treated with respect. You know, that's the job of us in civil society to create that context. But you know, we need people to also buy into that idea because it works. 5 years ago, you'd tell me that Australia's a country captured by the coal industry. And if you would have told me 5 years ago that we'd gotten Australia's big four banks to all commit to be out of thermal coal by 2030, you know, people were saying that's impossible. And then it happened. And it happened because we just built more and more power and stronger voices until enough people made it clear this is what we want, and the banks changed.
In Australia, did you put pressure on the banks through institutional investors?
Yeah, we did indeed. So we used shareholder interventions, not just shareholder proposals, but there are other things you can do. You can seek votes against directors. You can put up directors. You can nominate directors, for instance. Right. You can do things outside of an AGM season as well. You can ask for information, material, discovery, all that kind of thing. But yes, we use that avenue. We predominantly used customers, but also shareholders of the bank as well, small and large.
Do you work in countries? I'm sorry, I don't mean to turn this into just a two-person dialogue. Further questions from the floor? Yeah, sure, Mara.
Sorry, I hope it's okay. I'll ask another question. So I've been reporting on environmental and climate issues for a few years now, and one of the challenges that I face in my work is, I think most people recognize, climate change exists. We are all implicated in its risks, but many people don't necessarily take the initiative to take action, whether it's through voting, whether it's through where they put their money or, their consumer choices. So I think there is a bit of a wall of apathy, if you will. So, you talk about the importance of building power and, encouraging people to feel empowered. So what role, we're journalists here, what kind of advice or thoughts do you have for us in terms of our work? What role does the media play in building that power that you speak of?
I'll answer this question, but try not to tell you how to do your job at the same time. I mean, because the obvious answer is to question, but that's such a fundamental aspect of journalism. But it doesn't happen as much as it should. A case in point, gas is described as a transitional fuel. It's described by that as such by companies like Mitsubishi, but then you open up their corporate strategy, and this doesn't take a huge amount of scrutineering. It's evident. It's on the surface. Their corporate strategy is aligned to something in the order of 3 degrees of global warming. So they're using gas to transition to climate catastrophe. So yeah, it might be a transitional fuel, but it's transitioning us to hell. That kind of scrutineering, I think, is necessary. Obviously, those who cover companies will need to do that a lot more, but it will be the same from governments. I mean, like I've explained, it's a very tight nexus. It's a really close relationship, and the same narratives are being used. It's just astonishing how much the industry was able to get away with saying, because of the crisis in Ukraine, we need to build a raft of new LNG projects in 5 years' time. What on earth are you talking about? And yet that narrative just sails through largely unchallenged. I think it's important to remember, especially with companies, if you want to know what companies are all about, you do need to look at their articles of incorporation. They're here to make money. They will get away with as much as we're willing to let them get away with. And I think it's just that constant element of scrutiny that is necessary. Not necessarily taking the corporate marketing, which is very flashy and very expensive, but not taking it at face value. So apologies to any journalists I may have offended in that response. But it is very much about just looking even slightly beneath the surface sometimes, or even on it.
Right, okay. We've come to the end of our hour. I will just mention that there is a lot of information available on the websites of market forces. Where else can they look? In Japan, the Kiko network, which is, I can say from my own reporting, is a great source of information on environmental issues.
I'd also say Fossil Free Japan is a great place that brings together a lot of what we've been discussing today. And also for those following the shareholder proposals at the moment, we're continuously updating that website as more information, as votes become known, for instance, as that rolls on. It's a bit of a clearinghouse of information.
Okay, that's on Market Forces?
No, that's fossilfreejapan.org.
Fossilfreejapan.org. So the results of the votes will be...
They'll be displayed there moments after they go onto the stock exchange.
Right. Okay. I'd like to thank our guest, Julian Vincent, for coming by and bringing us up to date on their efforts here in Japan. Best of luck.
Thank you, and thanks to those listening as well. Yep. ありがとうございました。